Welcome to the PharmaPodcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. On this episode of the PharmaPodcast, my guest is Tara Cowling, President and Managing Principal at Medlior Health Outcomes Research. Tara is a leader in real-world evidence, health technology assessments, and outcomes research. Welcome to the PharmaPodcast, Tara.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, tell us about yourself and Medlior.
Yes, Medlior is an accidental journey, as I think a lot of entrepreneurs end up being. So I actually started my career in the UK, worked for NICE and market access roles for industry, moved back to Canada, and as people know, I like to joke, to the wrong side of the country, moved to beautiful Calgary, Alberta, where there was not a strong pharmaceutical presence or opportunities, and remote-based working wasn't really a thing. So I had to sort of look around to see what the career opportunities could be. So I was very fortunate to be offered a position in the data department of Alberta Health Services, where I worked for 5 years. And at the same time, I did some freelance work for some contract research organizations based out of Ontario. And then really just sort of discovered that commercial research was where my heart lied. I liked the pressure and wanted to do that full time. And then a few years into doing that, I was approached by industry in terms of the availability of health system data for industry-sponsored research. And this was back in, I want to say 2016. So it was quite forward-thinking. RWE hadn't really become a thing at that time, or it wasn't as popular topic as it is now. But that's sort of what started our journey as a company into doing real-world evidence studies, was from being asked that question many, many years ago, and then sort of navigating the process by which our company could access data. So we've been growing ever since. We have a multidisciplinary team of biostatisticians, epidemiologists, and clinical researchers. And our sort of bag is evidence generation. We're a very focused research group. We love generating evidence for decision-making purposes. So RWE is clearly one of the big areas for evidence generation right now in the HEOR industry. So that's one of the topics we're most passionate about and quite familiar with working with that type of data to inform decision-making.
All right, we're going to spend the next 20, 30 minutes on RWE. So how would you define real-world evidence, or RWE, and its importance in drug reimbursement and market access?
It's a fantastic question. And it's interesting, too, because I think sometimes when we talk about RWE, people instantly think, claims data or the health system data. And that is an important source of RWE. But really, RWE is derived from real world data. And real-world data is any type of data that's collected outside of a controlled clinical trial. So one of the ways that I look at it is, does it require ethics approval? It's probably RWE, because you're probably working with individual patient-level data. And there are a variety of sources that can generate RWE. So those RWD sources, or the data sources, can be everything from the claims data, some of the commercial data sets that there are in the US, registries, cohort studies, wearables. There are a tremendous number of data sources that are technically real-world data. It's patient data collected outside of a controlled clinical trial. And when that data is sort of potentially linked or not linked, it could just be from that single source, but analyzed, it becomes real-world evidence. So usually you'll have a research question, you'll decide what is the best source of data to answer that research question, you'll analyze it, and then you'll report it. And the reporting of that, or the analyzed data, is what real-world evidence is. And the reason it's becoming so popular, especially for drug reimbursement, is really just sort of what's happening in that sort of pharmaceutical development space. So we're seeing a lot of innovative therapies coming to market, and some of these therapies, especially in oncology, are often showing phenomenal results at phase 2. So it's really hard for decision makers because these are therapies that clearly have high potential. They may be really serving an unmet need in a particular patient population, but the clinical trial data isn't mature. They like to see phase 3 studies, comparative studies that really show this drug works better than the other drug, or maybe what the current standard of care is. But the conundrum is that to finish those phase 3 trials, either it's unethical because this treatment works so well, you couldn't ask people not to take it, or it's just going to take another couple of years for those phase 3s to be completed. So how can they start to create some certainty or address the uncertainty from the clinical trial data using other data sources? So this is where RWE has kind of been coming up and being very, very popular as a source of evidence to address the uncertainties that may be arising from clinical trial data. So clinical trials are absolutely needed. I don't think should ever replace clinical trial data. There's a point and a purpose to clinical trials and having very controlled settings to really determine, does this drug work and is it safe? But there's a different question that RWE addresses, which is usually around, the effectiveness of that drug. So understanding, who are the patients that really are going to be receiving this drug. So the clinical trials, because they're so controlled, the populations that they recruit are very controlled, and they tend to be younger populations so they can survive the trial and get to those endpoints and the timelines of the trial. They won't tend to have comorbidities because then you don't know if it's those other conditions that are affecting the results or the outcomes of that drug treatment, or is it the other conditions that they have? So they really have to be very selective in the patients that they recruit. However, the patients that end up receiving this drug once it's made available may not match the characteristics of the patients in those trials. So RWE can kind of address that uncertainty for decision makers by showing, this is how the real world population is currently being treated, and this is how they're responding to their current treatment. So it just addresses some really interesting areas of uncertainty that only real world evidence could really address, and then it sort of mitigates some of that risk for those decision makers. So it's very complementary to clinical trial evidence, but definitely serves a purpose when you think about the patient population and even understanding from a comparator perspective, how are patients doing on standard of care? Because often when these trials are designed, they're designed so many years before the current treatment or the current comparators are even available. So those manufacturers couldn't have included those comparators. They weren't available yet. But then they get to the decision makers who are saying, wait a minute, we want to know how you do compared to this drug that's now available or maybe is the standard of care. You need real world evidence at that point to be able to show that. So there's many opportunities for the leveraging of real world evidence to address different types of uncertainty that may be there based on the clinical trial. So whether it's a comparator arm, whether it's the standard of care, whether it's that generalizability of the patient population, there's really quite different kind of questions that RWE is well suited to address.
So what role do peripheral services like patient support programs and specialty pharmacies play in generating RWD, real world data, and how can they contribute to the overall understanding of a drug's effectiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when it comes to RWE, because it's so diverse, it's very, you think about an RCT is so specific. We have a protocol. This is how you execute an RCT. Our RWE is so vast. It's so broad. There's so many different types of study designs that really it comes down to sort of the sort of scientific principles of, what is the best available evidence to address this research question? And it may not be the RCT design. It may be an observational study, which is what RWE is. So we always look at it as fit for purpose. Is that data source fit for purpose? So what is the uncertainty, and would that data source be fit for purpose to address that uncertainty? So PSPs are an amazing opportunity because obviously you're being able to demonstrate how the drug is working in that eligible or potentially eligible patient population, right? So you're being able to sort of gather that data potentially, prior to reimbursement, to showcase that information, or potentially to be using it as, the coverage with evidence framework starts to get developed. It could potentially potentially be used as that data source during that time in which additional data is collected. The drawbacks of PSP data are that it's not a comparative data source, and there may be some sampling bias in terms of the patients that are in that PSP, but that may not matter depending on what the actual question is. So it really comes down to what is that uncertainty? Is that fit for purpose? And it is a valid data source. I think one of the challenges for specialty pharmacy and for PSPs is previously they were never designed for research. That wasn't the intention of them, was to generate research. So now with this whole advent of real world evidence, there's an opportunity to start designing them that way. And by designing them that way, what I mean is having a formalized protocol around what type of data are you going to collect? How are you going to analyze it? How do you ensure your study design is robust enough through that PSP data collection that the data it produces will meet the needs of those decision makers, or what it is you want to use that data for. And then the other key point is patient consent, right? Because of the type of data source this is versus health system data, you need patients to consent to their data being used for research purposes. In our experience, most patients are willing to consent. If it's for research purposes, it's to facilitate access for, patients to be able to get this treatment. They usually will, but there is a formal sort of research process that should start being sort of as the standard implemented in PSPs going forward, so that that data, can be leveraged and it can be used to inform that decision making. But I think there's many, many cases in which that data would be fit for purpose as long as it's been set up to be used for research. And some of the restrictions might be, if the data wasn't routinely captured, if there's any quality issues around the data. So some validation of that data source would need to be conducted. And that's why you need to set it up with sort of a research study framework in mind, as opposed to setting it up and then thinking about research after the fact. At that point, you may find that there are certain issues that you can't overcome for utilizing that data for decision making. But I think going forward, it should definitely be seen as a great resource.
So who should take the responsibility for translating real world experiences into RWE? The service provider, the drug manufacturer, and what are the advantages and challenges of each approach?
I think one of the challenges, that usually gets flagged when manufacturers collect data, and even PSP data, which there is still a service provider involved, but they're more directly involved in some respects. There's always that risk of bias, right? So there's always concerns that this is a biased data source, depending on the level of involvement from the manufacturer. So I think the ways to mitigate that is to use, again, that sort of scientific methodology by preparing a protocol before you start collecting data, even publishing that protocol. There's RWE registries now where you sort of like clinicaltrials.gov. It's an ISPOR RWE website where you can put your protocol on there saying, we're going to collect the data. This is our protocol. So it sort of keeps that robustness up to a different level, because then if you report different outcomes or you analyze your data differently, you have to justify that because you already put into the public domain what it was you were going to do. So having that sort of an approach, a more kind of research focused approach, having co-investigators, or sort of a steering group involved in that PSP if it's going to be used for research purposes, where you have clinicians or other sorts of stakeholders who can validate how the data was collected, how it was reported, and making sure that there is transparency in that reporting. I think transparency, honestly, is one of the biggest issues with RWE, right? That really is where everything hangs in terms of understanding, is this a reliable data source for decision makers? So the decision makers in CADIS RWE guidance heavily spoke to this, which is around transparency. They want to know what you did, how you did it, so they can understand the reliability of the results. So I think manufacturers are going to be inevitably involved at the end of the day, because it is their product. I think it helps when there are third parties, because again, you're putting some sort of liability on another organization to say this is true. So I do think having that third party facilitation can be helpful, but I think more than anything, it is having a rigorous, approach to how you're going to collect, analyze, and report that data, and then you're reporting it in a way where any kind of concerns around transparency have been mitigated.
So what criteria should be used to determine which real world data should be translated into real world evidence? And how can we ensure that the selected data is representative and reliable?
That's such a good question. What we tend to do, and I know a lot of other organizations in the space tend to do, is things called feasibility assessments. So what will happen typically is you're presented with a research question. So there is uncertainty. Either the manufacturers are looking at their competitors and what was the pushback they got, either at a regulatory or reimbursement level on their data. So they kind of have an understanding of what they might be facing, or even if it's a different indication, similar data. So it's like, where does the uncertainty lie? I think most people now have a good understanding. The uncertainty is going to typically lie, again, in those sorts of main areas around, diverse populations, this is the clinical trial uncertainty, lack of follow-up, lack of the standard of care comparators, things like that. So it's sometimes it's, in the pipeline sort of phases even when the trials are still being run, you already know where those gaps are. You sort of know what's going to be missing, what could the pushback be. Genuinely, if you have good phase 3 data, you do not need RWE still. So that's kind of a misconception. I think people think, we always have to have RWE now. No, you really don't. It's just the fact that these innovative therapies or rare disease conditions are never going to have the clinical trial data that will typically be needed, either because they're so effective so early in their trial sort of life cycle that, coming to market earlier would greatly benefit patients, or the trials just aren't feasible because of those rare diseases. So for those conditions, the manufacturers typically know they're going to need some RWE in order to facilitate that market access. And then every single product is a little bit different in terms of, but what is that uncertainty? So once you understand what the uncertainty or the pushback could be, then you can identify, what's the best data source to address that? Because is it an outcome? Were there certain outcomes, clinical outcomes, that were not captured by the clinical trial? And a typical one is often patient-reported outcomes or quality of life outcomes. So maybe as this development, the product life cycle has progressed, they've really uncovered that as part of their value proposition, or one of the strengths of their product may be something along those lines. Typically that may not have been actually captured in the clinical trial. So they need to now go get real world evidence to be able to demonstrate that. Or then maybe there's a different type of clinical outcome or different type of disease, progression that they want to be able to track and show, to again, sort of justify their value proposition. So it's always going to come down to, what data do you need? And then what is the best data source for using that? So a good example is administrative data is very good for things like treatment patterns, health system utilization, and costs. It's not great for disease severity, disease progression, unless it's like lab data. But oftentimes some of that data would be in the patient chart. It's not routinely collected. It's not standardized. So a registry may be a much better data source for that particular uncertainty or clinical outcome. So this is where those feasibility assessments come in, is like, what is the uncertainty? And then sort of looking, what are all the available data sources? Is there a registry study? Is there a cohort study? Can we get this from health system data? Or if none of the above, do we need to prospectively actually collect this? No one's collected it. We need to go out and collect this to be able to complete that evidence package for the decision makers. So that's really that question of which data source really relies on, what is the uncertainty, or what are the outcomes that you need that are not being captured in the clinical trial, that you need to go out there and be able to capture to complete that evidence submission. So it really will be different on a case-by-case basis. We know that data provenance, so where did the data come from, is very important for decision makers. So there's a wariness with commercial data sets often. So we're very lucky in Canada to have our public health system. It's the government's data. So if you're working either with, Alberta data or, Ontario data, those governmental data, it's going to be a robust data source. Once you get into registries, now you have to look at, that data governance. How is the data collection? What details can you provide to show that this is a robust data source? It's high quality. Same thing with PSP. So, in terms of, you need the best data in terms of who's capturing it. And then the second layer is, are there any concerns with the quality of that data for analyzing it and then reporting it for decision makers? So there's a bit of a process, I think, to really understanding what is the best data to create the RWE that you need.
In a previous response, you raised the concern about the potential bias and data quality issues associated with RWE. How do you see these challenges being overcome in the future?
I think it all comes down to transparency. Really, I do. I think, not to be a cynic, but everything's biased, to a large extent. It's very hard to get rid of bias entirely, so it's like nothing's perfect. There is no silver bullet. There's always going to be certain risks with any type of data set that's been gathered. So I think when it comes to mitigating, particularly that manufacturer bias, it really comes down to transparency. It really comes down to being very clear about how the data was collected, how it was analyzed, and how it was reported. I think if you can clearly demonstrate that and demonstrate like why that data, source was used or was collected in the way that it was, it can then facilitate the review of that data and the inclusion of that data into decision making. I think that the bias or that risk of bias is most debilitating when that is unknown, if there is any uncertainties or ambiguity in how that data was collected or how it was analyzed, and you're just giving numbers of like, oh, here's our RWE, here's our results. It's not about the results. They need to know everything that happened in terms of the methods that were used to generate it. So, RWE even more so than RCTs, because RCTs are so prescribed in terms of their methodology, where RWE isn't. That methodology for RWE particularly is of vital importance for being able to evaluate the quality of the data to then allow it to sort of be considered for decision making.
Can you share some examples of successful applications of RWE in shaping drug reimbursement and market access policies?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had some really great experiences. A lot of the work we've done specifically at Medlior has been around understanding particular patient populations in the Canadian context. So the way it's usually phrased is burden of disease. So who are these patients in Canada that have this particular condition? So definitely looking at that epidemiology, prevalence, incidence, looking at what are their current treatments. Because often what's really interesting, and this is one of the things I love about RWE, it will often surprise you what you find from that health system data. And the clinicians will be like, yep, we knew it. This is exactly what's happening. But it's not what the guidelines are saying is happening. So oftentimes with decision makers, they're kind of looking at, oh, this is how patients are supposed to be treated. And the manufacturer knows, and the clinicians sort of know, but that's not how they're treated, and there's reasons for that. And it may be a variety of things in terms of how patients react to certain side effects. So they don't want to take that standard of care. There could be other influences that may not make them want to take that standard of care. So we've had some great studies where we've been able to really demonstrate, what's really happening in Canada to facilitate that decision making. So one, perfect example is a study we did in cardiovascular disease, where we were just looking again at the burden of illness. Who are these people who have these cardiovascular events? We had over about 280,000 people in Alberta who had one of these events during the time of our study. And their current treatment or their standard of care should be statins, and statins are cheap and effective. However, we found that among this population who had an event, only 60% of them were actually taking a statin. And you're kind of going, oh, like you were hospitalized. You had a very serious cardiovascular event. This is your treatment for mitigating future events. And yet only 60% are taking it. So it was fascinating talking to, the clinical advisor and obviously the manufacturer team going, why is that? Like, why is this happening? Are they not being prescribed this treatment, or is the patient not taking this treatment? So it can certainly open the doors for future conversations. But among the 60% that were being treated, again, only about 60% were adherent to their treatment. And what was interesting is when we published this study in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology, my kind of giggle was that actually wasn't anything new. The clinical community kind of knows this. They know that there's an undermanagement of these patients. Understanding the nuances of why was still not determined, but they knew that these patients were being undermanaged. And you could so clearly see that with a 280,000 population study of, how many patients are currently on treatment, and of those, how many are adherent. So the journal, and usually for observational study, does not get a lot of accolades. They usually prefer their RCTs and whatnot. But the journal actually came out out with an editorial on this paper with the editor saying important data, important topic, because highlighting real world data is so important for clinical practice. And even the journal itself did like a PR statement about it as well, because they felt like this type of information really does need to inform and improve clinical practice. Now, needless to say, from the manufacturer's perspective, this demonstrated that sort of unmet need and why a new therapy, might be able to fit within this current treatment pathway. So there are some really great instances of where RWE can really provide insights that you would otherwise, you just couldn't get that from a clinical trial in terms of demonstrating that unmet need for that current patient population. Because oftentimes at either the regulatory reimbursement level, but there's a treatment available, the patient should be taking that, but they're not. And you can't demonstrate that they're not unless you go in and do those types of studies and actually look at that data. So we have definitely seen where doing those sorts of studies has informed that decision-making process by highlighting what does that burden of illness look like in Canada? Who are those patients? How reflective is the clinical trial data of that Canadian population? Because to a certain extent, maybe it's worse than the clinical trial is showing. Like maybe there's more of a need than the clinical trial even demonstrated because its population may not have been as severe as the actual population that, is currently in Canada with that condition. So they're fascinating studies, and from our discussions with, certainly the reimbursement groups and payers, they really enjoy these studies. If they're well conducted, they find them fantastic. They love seeing studies and data from their jurisdiction. Often clinical trials are full of patient populations that may not be Canadian patients. They may not have the standard of care that's currently available in Canada. So seeing these types of studies being executed in Canada and having that data is fantastic. What we don't know is what are they doing with it? You know what I mean? Is it a nice to have and it's anecdotal, maybe a little contextual, or is it actually informing decision-making? And I think this is where it's on a case-by-case basis and having more clarity from the reimbursement, and payers in terms of what is it that they need to see to inform their decision-making. What type of evidence would really inform and potentially change their decision-making. And so, in my opinion, the best way to do that would be at that early scientific advice process. What I would love to see is a conversation between the manufacturer, the reimbursement agency, and then if there is a sort of a third party that's going to be conducting that research, there's a conversation. One of the best experiences we've had in the past is we had a meeting with a reimbursement agency. This was for a resubmission, mind you. And it was a discussion around what RWE could be collected to provide that manufacturer with a different outcome. And so I was thrilled that the reimbursement agency was willing to have that meeting, presented a protocol for this is what the study could look like. The reimbursement agency was thrilled because they didn't want to see the same data repackaged, more analyses of their clinical trial data. This was a new study. So they were like, oh, this is great. And then we showed them the protocol. This is what we're going to collect. This is how we're going to collect it. They provided input. They were like, we want to see this, this, and this. Sure, we haven't done the study yet. We can absolutely adjust our protocol to do that. And then we're now going to be able to collect and report, the data that they need, knowing that that will better inform their decision-making process. I think what happens right now at the scientific advice process, there certainly can be a discussion about RWE and what those gaps are, but it doesn't go down to the level of like a protocol. You know what I mean? So, okay, we all understand where the uncertainty lies, but this is the data source we're going to use. This is how we're going to analyze that data, and this is how we're going to report that data. Does that align with sort of the needs of your organization? If we do it this way, will that, generally be accepted as high quality evidence and used for your decision making? They're not there yet. I think that's a place they would like to get to, but they're not there yet. So it's still in this sort of frustrating, there's gaps, RWE, but kind of don't know. Depends on what you show us. Be transparent, and my problem with that is you could design a study 50 different ways based on that uncertainty. And it would be nice to have some guidance on that study design to make sure that it is going to align with what it is they want to see. So I feel like that's still an area that needs some more development in Canada. You kind of see that through NICE, through things like the Cancer Drug Fund, because there's a data collection agreement that happens between the manufacturer and the NHS. So there's an understanding of the type of data you're going to collect that then goes back into the reimbursement process, through NICE to do that evaluation. So now that we have PCPA kind of coming out saying about coverage with evidence, it would be great to see that discussion really get into the weeds of what data, how are you going to collect it, how are you going to report it? And then it's just going to create so much more certainty for manufacturers that it is worth the time and money to go out and do those studies.
All right, let's talk about collaboration between the different stakeholders. You touched on that. So how can collaboration between healthcare providers, manufacturers, and patient advocacy groups enhance the generation and utilization of RWE?
There's so much opportunity for collaboration. I think, and you pretty much require it, I think, with these sorts of studies. So you need, obviously, the manufacturer typically to be the one initiating the study and to be funding the study. They also have a lot of internal expertise when it comes to their treatment and understanding of their clinical trial data and what those gaps and uncertainty can look like. So they are an important stakeholder, I believe, in that process. The clinical community is essential, not only for validating the study, for saying, yes, based on the data that's, that interpretation of findings, right, is really where you need that clinical input. But we also value it at the protocol stage, where we can share with the clinical advisors, this is the uncertainty. This is how we're going to address it. We've often had them saying, yeah, add this, right? Here are some outcomes, or here are some measures that you'll need to really interpret those results to be able to say, this is this. So they're fantastic. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if this drug does become available in the market, you want to inform clinical practice. So having the clinicians as part of this, and to be honest with you, the projects we've done, they love it. They love being on these, they love real world evidence because it's validating their clinical existence, right? They're like, that's exactly what I'm seeing. So they get very enthusiastic about participating in these studies and really enjoy that collaboration. So we've had very positive experiences with clinicians. I think patient advocates and patient groups have been grossly underrepresented in these studies. I think there's much more opportunity to bring them to the table to participate, not only through different types of real-world evidence generation, so thinking about, the registries, thinking about even surveys, patient-reported outcome data that has to be collected by, doing those survey-style methodologies, and participating and advocating for patients to participate in those studies. I think they've got a huge role. I think the trickiest one, to be honest with you, is when we get into this, area of value-based medicine and what's important to the patients, what outcomes are important to them, for them to feel like this is a valuable treatment, and I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still very heavily reliant on those typical clinical measures. And I think a great area, as an example, is oncology, where we like hard outcomes. We like survival. It's a nice hard outcome that we can measure. And since oncology and the evolution of screening and these, personalized treatments, they're amazing. It's becoming a chronic disease. Survival is much harder to actually measure because patients are living longer. So now it becomes more of a quality of life story when it comes to the value of these treatments. But that then relies on the decision makers, and it's hard for them because it's not as hard and objective as an outcome. So how do they value that when they are looking at the cost of these treatments? So I think that the patient group needs to be represented more in these studies, absolutely. But I think the types of outcomes that patients are telling us that they would like to see be considered, to inform the decision-making process, we're sort of not there yet. And I think one of the issues for a lot of the patient groups is they don't have the resources to really be able to get into the research and understand, okay, like how can we collect and report this type of data that's important to us, to those decision makers. So I think there's just an opportunity for the ecosystem at large to bring the patient groups more fully into it so that they feel that they do have a voice and they are engaged in these studies, because you can collect the data that is important to them. You just have to plan to do that, right? In sort of that protocol and that early stage. But I think, precedent is always something that people like to fall back on because it helps justify decisions. And our precedent is based on more clinical outcomes rather than patient-centric outcomes. So I think there's going to be an evolution there. I don't think it's hit yet, but I do think it's coming. But I think it's incredibly challenging because often it is, more subjective than objective, and getting comfortable with that when it comes to decision making.
Okay, so let's talk about a technology. So in what ways can technology and data analytics contribute to the collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of RWE?
It's just good stuff. I mean, technology is amazing. There's so many technological advances. So we were talking before we started the podcast about how RWE's been around forever. These were chart reviews back in the day, right? And those were time and money. I mean, they were expensive projects to do, very, very laborious. And now there's technology, when you have these unstructured data, which is the free text data, you've got natural language processing, you've got AI to be able to extract, and even things like images, to be able to take an image, here's the result. So the evolution of technology is really creating higher quality data sources for us to be able to leverage more quickly and much more cost effectively. So I think, that the technological advance, this is big data in this space. You are talking, like our study, 280,000 patients. That's a lot of data over a 10-year period, because it's all of their health system data over that 10-year period. So they're really, really large data sets. And so to be able to apply the newest advances in statistical software and programming, to be able to apply things like natural language processing when it comes to doing those chart reviews in 2023, and even things like patient surveys, utilizing social media, utilizing wearable data. There are so many opportunities for technology now, and it's just continuing to advance. So I think the challenge is, I think the technology is there, and I think the science is there. It's creating that sort of comfort with the decision makers with these advances that are very new. AI is such a perfect example. AI is here and it's doing stuff, and yet you have these decision makers who have a lot of uncertainty. There's a lack of precedent. So it creates that cautiousness and that conservativeness towards allowing those sorts of technologies to be used to inform decision making. So I think, that is an area, it's always going to be that area. We've got to get new policies, new frameworks, new guidance in terms of how can we leverage the technologies that are available to inform decision making. So I think there's just that little bit of a gap between the technology being there, but the decision makers' acceptance of some of that technology not quite being there yet.
All right. So what then are the potential limitations or caveats of relying solely on RWE for drug reimbursement and market access decisions?
I think, it always comes again, that best available evidence, right? And as I say, there are circumstances, they're not many, but like rare disease, where the pragmaticness, your actual feasibility of conducting an RCT is so difficult because patients are so dispersed and there's so few of them. How could you ever get them into a single trial center? Like, they'd have to move. They'd have to go live somewhere for like a year or two, like uproot their whole life and to be there. So it's just like, this is really hard. So, there's definitely workarounds that have been done in the rare disease community to have ways of collecting that data from geographically very dispersed populations and low sample sizes. But for the by and large, majority of conditions, we still need RCTs. They are definitely that gold standard when it comes to, does it work and is it safe? Because you need to control for every other type of variable in order to say it is the drug that is making that impact and not anything else that's happening with that particular patient. So you can't get that level of certainty unless you do an RCT. You're never truly going to scientifically be able to say, and I think this is where, with the FDA really kind of coming out being very pro RWE, a lot of that is because they are statistically controlling for a lot of those variables in very, very large populations. There's still some uncertainty, and oftentimes we see, drugs sometimes being retracted. Once their phase 3 trial data is actually available, actually it didn't look as good as the RWE data. So I think different countries have different levels of conservativeness when it comes to allowing access based on RWE data. I think it really should be used as more of a complementary tool, because I do think scientifically that RCT, when it comes to that safety and efficacy, that is the model. Like, that is the most certain model you can have for determining that. RWE, a host of other applications and different things that it can address and answer more appropriately than an RCT ever could. So it's that difficult thing of you really need both. And then it becomes, which do you use for what? So I think from a regulatory and reimbursement perspective, we're never going to lose RCTs, or we shouldn't lose RCTs. But there is a pragmatic side that if that delays access for patients because we're waiting for this beautiful, perfect, fully robust and completed data to be done, no, and then we've got a problem. So that's where I think, we can have certainly that phase 2 data that's very, very promising, and then bring in the RWE to complement that data to facilitate that access for patients, so they're not waiting for all of the clinical trial data to be complete. But what's interesting, and certainly a topic in Canada and in many other jurisdictions, is that sort of reassessment. So once all that clinical trial data is complete, how do we then put it back through some sort of reassessment to make sure, should we continue paying for this drug? Is it living up to, the value that we had expected when we negotiated that price for it? Maybe more people should take it. Maybe we could expand the indication because of the RWE data, or maybe it should be in the reverse direction. But either way, I think allowing earlier access requires a process where there is still going to be some follow-up. And I think that's what particularly Canada is really trying to figure out right now, how to implement that process. I'm sure they will. That process is definitely there in some of the other jurisdictions where they have this, more established coverage with evidence kind of period, where it's more defined, it's more transparent what that process looks like. So I think it's always that, little bit of a sweet spot of how do you allow the fastest access possible while still making sure this treatment is effective and safe. And so there's always going to be that little bit of wiggle room. So for a lot of manufacturers, I think they see Health Canada as being the determinant of, does it work? Is it safe? Then we should allow access for a lot of these treatments at that point. And then allow, after some more data has been collected, for it to go through organizations like Hadith or NS. So there's many different, I think, kind of ways of looking at it. But I think, it is finding that based on this particular patient population, what is the best approach? And I think it will vary based on the patient population and what current treatments are already available for them, if they should follow a traditional path, or if there's a more expedited path that, that risk is worth it.
So can RWE help address disparities in healthcare access and outcomes across different populations and regions, or?
Well, absolutely across, regions, for sure. You can definitely, through RWE, understand how are patients in Canada with a particular condition being treated. I think one of the issues with our sort of decentralized healthcare system is inequities in access, where certain provinces, will negotiate to have that drug added to their formulary, others won't. So there absolutely could be an opportunity to utilize RWE to sort of show what those disparities look like across Canada. One of the big areas for this is rare disease, as you probably know, because there's so few patients. Doing this at a provincial level absolutely could cause inequities across the country, where patients with a rare disease get treatment in one province, they don't in another, and it's purely based on how many patients there are within that province. And when there's small populations, obviously that can have a much bigger effect. So, with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, one of the things they're looking at is more of that national level coverage, national level decision making and coverage for those treatments, because doing it in the traditional way, absolutely, and it has already created inequities where people need to move province to get treatment, which is obviously not the ideal situation at all. So utilizing real world evidence, I think, especially in rare disease, and creating that equity and access is a huge opportunity.
Okay, let's talk about the ethics. Are there any ethical considerations or privacy concerns associated with the collection and the use of RWE, and how can they be addressed?
For sure. So it depends on your data source. You're always going to need ethics, quite frankly. You're always going to need ethics. So if you're working with health system data under the Health Information Act, the data that the health system captures on us can be used for research purposes. So you can waive patient consent, but you still require ethics. You still have to show that this study will benefit the patient and health system, i.e. it's not for commercial use. So you're always going to have, even PSPs need ethics. Every registries need ethics. You're always going to have that ethical consideration of this is what we're collecting and why. And the why is very important, especially ethically speaking. You should never collect data you do not have a reason for collecting. You shouldn't ask the question unless you know exactly what you're going to do with the answer. There should never be this, oh, nice to know. It should all be need to know. And you should be able to justify that. So ethics is really your sort of first line of defense, right? For you develop your protocol, you put it into ethics, and you have an independent committee look at the need for collecting this data, this patient level data, and whether you will be doing it in a way that is ethical, that is robust, and that serves that sort of greater good or that purpose. So I think ethics plays a huge role when it comes to real world evidence studies, and I think I feel personally very good about being, a Canadian and having my data be in this health system, knowing that it can't be accessed without that sort of process being in place. And as I say, for every form of real world evidence in Canada, you would need to have that not only that ethics approval, but in cases where it's not health system data, you would need to consent to your data being used and for what purpose. So I think that's a really important part of the process when it comes to real world evidence.
All right. So what are some strategies for effectively communicating RWE to the different stakeholders, including policymakers, healthcare providers, and patients?
I think, the decision makers particularly, they are looking for published data, so not only have you got ethics, you've also gone through a peer review process. A lot of them, particularly in S, is very clear that they like to see published manuscripts when it comes to studies that are being submitted by manufacturers. And obviously the RCT data, goes through that sort of a process as well. So I do think that's really important that RWE studies are designed with that sort of public dissemination in mind, that you're willing to stand behind the results that you are putting out there. So publication, peer review publication is very important for that. I think also thinking about the clinical community, how it can impact and improve patient care. So, being able to put your studies into clinical conferences, I think are really important as well. And then sharing it with those patient groups that these studies may be relevant to, so that their community knows this study has been done and this is what we found. So I think, there's so many opportunities for disseminating this evidence and making it certainly more comfortable for patients, to see this type of evidence being generated. They can see the results of the studies they're participating in. I think that's really important. And then for the decision makers, seeing that peer review publication, I think is really helps, ensure that study has been well conducted.
Well, Tara, I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to ask one more because it is approaching an hour. So a lot to discuss.
Just talk all day.
And there's a lot to discuss. So I'm going to skip over some questions and maybe we can address that in a future podcast. But my last question is, in your opinion, what are the key takeaways or messages that you would like our listeners to remember about the importance of RWE in drug reimbursement and market access?
It can really be summed up as fit for purpose. We are going to need RWE. There is going to be uncertainties from clinical trials. So it's so vital when it comes to generating RWE that you look at your RWD or your data. Is it fit for purpose? I think there's times where people want to put a round peg in a square hole because it's faster, cheaper, or somewhat convenient. You really need to think, if you're going for regulatory reimbursement, is your data fit for purpose? Because there are many different data sources that are available to answer those research questions, and thinking about that rigor and thinking about the end result and the decision making and the value of doing a well-designed study is so important. That fit for purpose is really like my key tagline when it comes to thinking about real-world evidence for decision making.
Any final insights you want to share with the audience? Is there any questions I didn't ask that I should have asked?
Well, just because this probably is more of a manufacturer audience, like I think one of the big things is this data is not fast. And many people who've splashed in this area know this. So to be able to work with the health system data particularly, which is usually your prime data source because the data provenance, like where the data is being generated, is your top dog. It takes about 12 months to do one of these studies. So thinking about the execution, thinking about these needs in the pipeline stages, the most successful experiences we've had are when manufacturers have a product in pipeline. They already know, what their kind of clinical trial program is going to look like. They sit down with an advisory board to talk about what are the gaps, prioritizing those gaps, doing a feasibility assessment to then see, well, what are the data opportunities, and then executing a study. But you need to be thinking about this at least 2 years prior to launch. The closer you get to launch, the fewer the options that you have, and the lower the quality of the data is going to be that you're going to be able to collect. So that's sort of my ending remark, is just to be thinking about RWE as early as possible. You really want to be getting in that 2 to 5 year period pre-launch to start thinking about that. You don't have to engage in the full study, but you need to start developing your strategy for what RWE are you going to need and how are you going to go about getting that, not leaving it till the last minute prior to a CADA submission, because it's not quick.
Well, Tara, thank you for being a guest on the Pharma Podcast and sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
How can our listeners connect with you?
Oh, we have easy to find website, medlior.com, medlior.com, or you can reach out to me at tara.cowling@medlior.com as well. So yeah, please reach out. We'd love to ask or address any other questions on RWE.
Contact details for Tara will be made available on our website at thepharmapodcast.com. Thank you for listening. The Pharma Podcast is available to listen to for free on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, and on our website at thepharmapodcast.com. We are also available on YouTube. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts.